Hey, everybody. It is Thursday, March 13th. You're listening to the Mo News Podcast. I'm Moshe Wanunu.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to, including Jill tried to get smart in the last 24 hours on Greenland politics. They had a big parliamentary election with ramifications for what we've been talking about. So we'll have that in today's podcast.
With much time spent trying to figure out how to pronounce the names of their political parties. Not easy.
Well, which political parties even exist there, what the expectations were. And it's fascinating because, it's the biggest island in the world, but has 40,000 eligible voters. So basically, a relatively small town here in America.
Right. I live on a much smaller island, home to more than 2 million people.
Yes, a very long one.
I feel like I was going to say that's what she said.
So we'll have that in today's podcast. And we should mention for everyone out there today, March 13th, National Popcorn Lovers Day. And who doesn't love popcorn?
Well, you asked me before we started, do you like popcorn? And I felt that there was something in your voice that was like, please say yes. Please do not be the one person in America who doesn't like popcorn. And yes, I love popcorn.
Yes, we are pro popcorn here. We don't take many stances on the Mo News Podcast, but one that we do take is we are advocates for popcorn. In particular, Jill, kettle corn.
What is not to like? It is popcorn with sugar.
So go and get yourself some popcorn. I mean, even support your local movie theater. Even if you don't go see a movie, go buy yourself a bag of popcorn over there. They have to go. Do they have to go orders there at the movie theater, Jill?
They should. It's a brilliant idea.
Like a drive-through?
It's amazing because regular popcorn, as good as it is never as good as movie theater popcorn.
Whatever they're doing with the butter, I don't want to know what they're doing. But whatever they're doing, it's excellent.
Ignorance is bliss. Okay, to the headlines now, starting with the Palestinian Columbia student activist in ICE custody. He had a closely watched hearing on Wednesday. We'll tell you what happened. In Washington, D.C., Senate Democrats are playing hardball when it comes to the budget bill. With 2 days until a shutdown, they're saying we're not on board with the Republicans' short-term spending bill.
Yeah, so we are less than 48 hours till a government shutdown. We thought there wasn't going to be one. There might still not be one, but you know what Congress does. They take things down to the wire.
And Moshe, does beg the question, are Democrats having an identity crisis, trying to figure out the best strategy to win back Congress and the White House?
One prominent Democrat with a very unique strategy, that's Gavin Newsom. Those of you in California call him governor. He's had a number of conservatives on his podcast. This week, Steve Bannon.
To the economy, finally some good news on inflation. Prices cooled off last month, but that was before the tariffs. We've got the numbers. Speaking of tariffs, the EU and Canada strike back at the tariffs now in place, escalating the trade war. HHS Secretary RFK Jr. pushing big food companies to ditch artificial dyes. And as we mentioned, an election we normally wouldn't be following, but it is 2025. So all eyes on Greenland, the results of their recent election. And a sign of the times, Chuck E. Cheese gets a rebrand, which means no more animatronic band.
Is it even Chuck E. Cheese if there's not a giant rat playing tambourine, Jill?
And Moshe has on this day in history.
Jill, it is that day of the year where we celebrate the birthday of a certain planet that has multiple pronunciations, some less appropriate than others.
Oh, I know. Okay, let's start with an update on the case of activist Mahmoud Khalil. He has led anti-Israel protests at Columbia University over the last 2 years. He was arrested by federal immigration authorities Saturday night. There was a brief hearing on Wednesday in Manhattan. Khalil himself wasn't there. He is currently detained in Louisiana. The federal judge, Jesse Furman, said Khalil should remain detained there. But he says that he would grant a request by Khalil's lawyers, allowing them to have privileged phone calls with him at least twice, one yesterday and one today. Lawyers said in court Wednesday that he was first brought to a detention center in New Jersey before being flown to another site in Louisiana. His attorneys say that they have been unable to have privileged communications with him since then. On Monday, a federal judge temporarily halted his removal from the United States, meaning that the government couldn't deport him before yesterday's hearing. Khalil is a permanent resident of the United States. He has a green card. The judge, though, not ruling yesterday on an effort by Khalil's lawyers to have him moved closer to his home in New York. Here is a bit of that statement.
My husband was kidnapped from our home, and it's shameful that the United States government continues to hold him because he stood for the rights and lives of his people. I demand his immediate release and return to our family.
Moshe, you posted this clip on the Instagram account, and I was reading through the comments. Many people said that they thought that the use of the word kidnapped was ironic or deliberately chosen, given that Khalil seemed to support the attacks on October 7th, in which Hamas kidnapped about 250 people, many of whom are still in Gaza, many of whom died there. Meanwhile, Khalil's attorneys say that he was chosen as an example to stifle entirely lawful dissent in violation of the First Amendment. But Secretary of State Marco Rubio says this case is not about free speech, that it is a clear visa violation case, saying that Khalil has publicly advocated for Hamas, a designated terrorist organization.
This is not about free speech. This is about people that don't have a right to be in the United States to begin with. No one has a right to a student visa. No one has a right to a green card, by the way. So when you apply for a student visa or any visa to enter the United States, we have a right to deny you for virtually any reason. But I think being a supporter of Hamas and coming into our universities and turning them upside down and being complicit in what are clearly crimes of vandalization, complicit in shutting down learning institutions. There are kids at these schools that can't go to class.
So it's notable here, this is what it's coming down to, right? Khalil's side says this is about free speech, dissent for the federal government, in particular for the Trump administration officials that you heard from Rubio there, and others. For them, it's about national security. They say you don't have a right to a visa in America. You don't have a right to a green card. And in fact, if you do things like advocate, at least in this case verbally, on behalf of a terrorist group, that means that the U.S. government can take the green card away from you, despite the fact that it's a permanent residency card. ICE arrested Khalil under a U.S. immigration law that allows the Secretary of State to deem him deportable as a potential foreign policy risk, given that Hamas itself is a designated terrorist organization. Rubio says, listen, he violated his visa. That means he violated his green card because that was all predicated on a number of rules you need to follow when he engaged in protests that shut down buildings at Columbia and defended things like the October 7th attacks by Hamas. As far as Rubio is concerned, this case is about enforcing immigration laws, not suppressing free speech. And as I mentioned, there's just a lot of rules that you have to abide by, whether you have a visa or a green card. Well, I heard from folks, Jill, in the Mo News community who say that they were often stopped if they're here on a visa or green card by TSA. They're asked additional questions. They have to say, among other things, whether they have an affiliation with a terrorist group or even support any terrorist group. You are not afforded the same rights as a U.S. citizen. And apparently, as a green card holder, we spoke to a visa expert yesterday, you can also be held without criminal charges for a while, as compared to those of us born here in the U.S. who are citizens, or those who eventually became citizens. Ultimately, they can't hold us for weeks at a time without charges, but you can do that to a green card holder. Now, nonetheless, as a green card holder, you do have due process rights. Your case must be heard before a judge, and it's a bit of what we're seeing unfold here when it comes to the Khalil case. The question, of course, is, does the U.S. government have specific evidence here of his support for Hamas? If so, they have not released it yet. The White House has spoken about his support, distribution of materials. They haven't released any evidence yet. Social media-wise, we haven't seen anything come up. We are aware that he, has run groups and been pictured with groups who have espoused support for Hamas. But the question is, what will a judge ask for here? How will they define, as we've been talking about the last couple of days, support for a group? If you're not fundraising for them, you're not an official member there. Verbally, what is the line? And how much leeway will be afforded to Marco Rubio and the administration in arguing, listen, we view him as a foreign policy threat, national security threat. That's why we've said this case might go to the Supreme Court here because the interesting implications around the First Amendment, visa law, national security, that's where these cases tend to go. Now, we should mention Khalil graduated in December with a master's degree from Columbia University. He was still living in a university-owned apartment when ICE authorities arrested him over the weekend. And it's created a really interesting division, Jill, at Columbia. You had some professors in recent days join students rallying behind Khalil. You saw those protesters outside the Manhattan courthouse yesterday. At the same time, there are students who felt threatened by the actions of the groups that he led as buildings were invaded. And you also have a number of employees and researchers who are impacted here, who are losing their jobs. Because remember, the U.S. government announced in recent days that they're cutting $400 million in grants to Columbia due to what has taken place on that campus, due to creating an unsafe environment for Jews, among others, on campus. So you have professors and researchers and staff who aren't marching for Khalil because they might be losing their jobs due to the impact of all of this. And then you also have the activists as well as some professors who are marching on Khalil's side. So an interesting thing to watch when it comes specifically to what's going on that campus.
Moshe, one thing that I've been hearing from people on both sides of this, whether they support Khalil being deported or think it's an overreach, they think none of this would have happened had Columbia just properly handled the situation regarding anti-Semitism on their campus and taken real steps to protect the Jewish students at the school.
Right. But remember, they were also under a lot of pressure, Jill, from the aforementioned professors and students who were not, happy with any crackdown on those protests and the encampments. Remember, Columbia did crack down on a bunch of students, booted them from campus, and then let them back in. And so they were coming under pressure from their own professors, who, eventually leads to the downfall of the previous president of Columbia University. They now have a leader there who's trying to salvage the pieces. So, the administration there felt like it's not as simple as far as they're concerned to say, we could have, just done one thing here, because that would have meant they were going to deal with a lot of angry professors and angry students. And so they've been trying to have a middle ground here, and it turns out that neither side is happy with what they've done. Nonetheless, here, Khalil remains in custody, in detention at a facility in Louisiana. By the way, one of the reasons he's down there, people believe, is because the U.S. government has friendly judges down there that are much more open to the arguments relating to deporting him. It's one of the reasons why the U.S. government wants to move the case down there. In the meantime, the New York judge still has it. He's looking for more arguments, more filings here in the coming days. There's some deadlines on Friday, deadline on Monday. So we're going to watch this case because this is going to be very interesting to watch.
All right, we're still on government shutdown watch. We told you yesterday the House passed a bill to keep the government open through September, but it makes some cuts that Democrats are not happy with.
Yes, those cuts have to do with veterans' health care, among some other non-defense spending. The bigger concern for Democrats is also that the way that this spending bill is structured, this extension through September, gives the president a lot of leeway to move money around. So typically the way that spending bills work is Congress says this money goes for this money goes for that. And then the White House basically has to follow those rules. The way this bill works, it allows the president to cut some things, move some things around, and ultimately Democrats not happy about that, how much power it gives him. And where they have power is the Senate. Democrats in the House basically voted against it for the most part and weren't able to get much done. In the Senate, because they have that filibuster standard, that's where Democrats feel like they have a negotiating position.
Right. So 60 votes are needed for legislation to pass the Senate, which means 8 Democrats will need to support this bill if voting goes the way that we think it will for Republicans. On Wednesday, Senate Democrats left a private meeting saying that there simply are not enough votes to advance the bill. The deadline, Friday night. So this does raise the chance of a government shutdown this weekend. Democrats are now in a very unusual position, potentially risking a government shutdown in order to get a better budget deal with Republicans.
And it's interesting here, Jill, because I mentioned Democrats concerned about how much leeway Trump may get if they prevent the shutdown by voting for this. They're also concerned that a shutdown may open up some things for Elon Musk and Donald Trump to do in regards to their government cuts. And so Democrats here had a very extended debate over there in the Senate yesterday to try to figure out which direction to go in.
Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer had privately told fellow Democrats that advocating for a shutdown, a bad look for Democrats. But Moshe, it does show a bit of the identity crisis happening right now in the Democratic Party. They lost the presidency, the House, and the Senate in November, and can't quite figure out the best strategy moving forward. Case in point, Governor Gavin Newsom of California, who is one of the most prominent Democrats in the country, has a new podcast and has been trying to find some common ground with the MAGA movement and conservatives.
Yeah, you might have seen This is Gavin Newsom. It's his brand new podcast, just a few episodes in here. Among others, I mentioned, he brought Steve Bannon on his podcast. Steve Bannon, the guy who was referred to in the past as like the brain of Trump, like super MAGA, sometimes is saying that, Trump is going too soft on Democrats. Last week, he had Charlie Kirk, who's a big conservative activist, also big in the Trump orbit. Michael Savage, another conservative, was on the podcast. And so what Gavin is trying to do here is, well, he's been the governor of the most liberal, what's viewed as the most liberal state in the country. Certainly, if you look at his track record when it comes to certain issues, he sees that there's some vulnerabilities for him, especially as he looks ahead towards a presidential run in 2028. So you're seeing him make this move to the center a bit. And it's so interesting that he's doing it, Jill, not just like on his own with fellow Democrats or with journalists or any other guests he could have on. He's doing it with people like in the Trump world and engaging in those conversations. And so what's really interesting is the pivot he made last week. You might have seen these headlines. We certainly addressed them over on the Instagram page, that he made headlines on transgender athletes and playing women's sports, saying that that's actually deeply unfair. Now, this has led to some criticism among progressives that he's basically moving towards the right when it comes to allowing transgender women in women's sports. But remember, we've told you the polling, it's an 80-20 issue. 80% of Americans do not believe that biological men, transsexual women, should be able to play in women's sports. And so he's going with the 80% here, but he's doing it alongside Charlie Kirk. Take a listen to this conversation.
Or should step out and say no.
No, and I appreciate.
But like, would you do something like that? Would you say no men in female sports?
Well, I think it's an issue of fairness. I completely agree with you on that.
So like, you right now should come out and be like, you know what? The young man who's about to win the state championship in the long jump in female sports,
right,
that shouldn't happen.
Completely fair on the issue of fairness. I completely agree. So that's easy to call out, the unfairness of that. There's also a humility and a grace, that these poor people are more likely to commit suicide, have anxiety and depression. And the way that people talk down to vulnerable communities is an issue that I have a hard time with.
So that's a break there with some in the Democratic Party, particularly folks on the left. But again, Newsom's making a bet that he's going to have to make a pivot to the center if he wants to win elections. He saw what happened to Kamala Harris. He's seen what happened to other Democrats. And the belief is that some of the progressive politics have effectively made the Democrats look extreme to a good portion of voters out there.
Moshe, we saw one of the most effective campaign ads for Donald Trump was the Kamala is for they, them, Donald Trump is for you.
Yeah, and Newsom acknowledges that in the Charlie Kirk conversation. Then he has the Bannon conversation where it's a good-natured conversation. He's getting a lot of flack from some on the left for even having Bannon on, given some of the more controversial things Bannon has done. Bannon also, did a salute that looked like a Nazi salute at a recent CPAC conference. So there's a lot of folks who are like, I can't believe he's platforming Steve Bannon. As far as Newsom is concerned, he's decided that this is a way to move to the middle. And so, we've seen in this past week here, and I've certainly heard it in my conversations with Democrats, you have the Al Greens of the world. He's the congressman who stood up and yelled at Trump with his cane, right? You had the Democrats who held up their paddles and walked out on Trump. You had 10 Democrats who joined Republicans to censure Al Green in the center, including the congressman who represents your district, Tom Suozzi. You have a whole spectrum of Democrats here. You don't have a single leader. You don't have a single voice. Some Democrats tell me that's not necessary right now. But nonetheless, you do sort of have this sort of existential crisis Democrats are going through right now as they try to figure out strategically what they should be doing in order to push up against the Trump agenda. And that's the one thing Democrats have in common here. They don't like what Trump is up to, but how to fight him, what to fight him on, and what issues to make their biggest issues is the nature of the debate right now among Democrats. One described it as a sort of a game of darts. They're just kind of throwing darts right now and saying like, we'll oppose this, we'll oppose this. Some have described it as like, well, we're going to go with a larger theme, which is Trump has brought in these billionaires like Elon Musk. He's not for you. And by helping this oligarchy, we can talk about on various issues how the Trump administration is not representing regular Americans and not taking care of the things he said he would be taking care of. And so they're pointing to the markets, they're pointing to the tariffs, they're pointing to the cuts to the government, including, a number of organizations like the VA. There's a school food program that the Agriculture Department announced that they were cutting $1 billion out of in the past 24 hours. And that's where Democrats see an opportunity. They're basically waiting for Trump to continue to make some moves, see the negative impact of that, and then address that. But the Newsom strategy, back to him, certainly an interesting one.
Time for the speed read from CBS News. A new report shows inflation cooled in February for the first time in 4 months, although still higher than the Federal Reserve would like. To the numbers now, inflation in February rose 2.8% year over year. That is still above the Fed's goal of 2%. The CPI tracks the change in prices for a bunch of goods and services typically bought by consumers. Now to what the economists say about it. Goldman Sachs saying that the report shows further signs of progress on underlying inflation, which is good, but that the Fed is still likely going to hold off on cutting interest rates at its meeting next week. And economists also note that the ongoing rise in food costs is creating a financial pinch for many households, although food costs overall did seem to moderate last month.
Yeah, egg prices have come down in the past couple of weeks here, but this is the February report. So we do see that the cost of eggs jumped significantly by about 60% February 2025 over February 2024. Again, coming down slightly in the last couple of weeks here in March. Now, at the same time, dairy, fruit, and vegetable prices were down. Coffee, we've told you about coffee. Coffee is up about 6%. So food inflation has been gradually accelerating since about the summer of last year, reaching about 5%. If you look at it on a 3-month scale here, other items that saw price hikes in February, car insurance, medical care, both up as well. And then there are the tariffs, where, we have talked to you about this, that prices could go up and have gone up in a number of categories, because the way tariffs work is when they're issued by the U.S. government on importers, that often means that the price goes up for consumers, because those importers will pass along that cost, that additional cost, to us, the consumer. Jill, one thing that struck me yesterday, the chief economist at J.P. Morgan says there is now officially a 40% chance of a U.S. recession this year and a risk of lasting damage to the country's standing as an investment destination if there is a continuing undermining of trust in the U.S. system, this unpredictability. And so we've talked about this before. The various banks put their percentages on stuff. They say there's a 40% chance of a recession over J.P. Morgan today. We'll continue to track all the banks and see recession or no recession. But the rhetoric from the White House continues to be, maybe that's necessary because we're trying to right-size the U.S. economy.
It wasn't so long ago on this very podcast, Moshe, that we were on recession watch. And then it kind of dissipated and everyone was feeling pretty good about the economy, but it's back.
Yeah, so there's like 3 watches we're on. We're always on government shutdown watch. We're on recession watch. And then for like that brief period last month, we were on asteroid watch. But now that's like back to a 0% chance of hitting Earth in 2032. And I know that weirdly enough, there's some of you who are disappointed in that.
I feel like I'm a little disappointed. I was interested with the fluctuating percentages.
Right, it was interesting that like there's a 3% chance we could be hit by an asteroid.
Also, it wasn't a humanity-ending asteroid.
Right. It was going to just take out, it was just a city-ending asteroid for somewhere in, like, along the equator.
All right, speaking of those tariffs that we were just mentioning, this is the latest on the trade war from the Washington Post. The European Union and Canada hit back Wednesday at President Trump's 25% steel and aluminum tariffs, with their own announcing tariffs on billions of dollars worth of U.S. products. This includes bourbon and motorcycles. The 27-nation EU said its 2-stage response would target about $28 billion in U.S. exports. Canada announced 25% retaliatory tariffs on about $21 billion worth of American goods. The U.S. decision to raise tariffs on all steel and aluminum imports to 25% is the latest salvo in Trump's campaign to reshape America's trading relationship with the world. European leaders have for months planned to swiftly retaliate, even as they've emphasized that a trade war hurts both sides. They have been trying to negotiate an off-ramp with the Trump administration. Remember, we told you yesterday, Trump backed down from 50% tariffs yesterday after a deal with Canada, but he still imposed those 25% tariffs globally yesterday.
Yeah, so those are the 25% global steel and aluminum. Separate from that, in the past 8 weeks, if you're tracking here at home, 10% and another 10%, so basically 20% tariffs on China. On some categories, by the way, we're up to 40 or 50% on certain Chinese products. There's the 25% tariff on Mexico, the 25% tariff on Canada. By the way, on Mexico, he lifted it for some items. There isn't total counter tariffs there, but there are tariffs happening there. So there's Canada, there's Mexico, there's China, there's the EU. Jill, I put up a clip from The Office yesterday that I thought explained tariffs to people, so to speak. The scene, the confrontation episode of The Office. Anyway, you can go check that out on the Instagram feed if you're an Office fan and you're looking for a 45-second Carell-esque understanding of tariffs. Very simplified.
Moshe, I watched that clip, and I think they just about capture a bit of the insanity that is a trade war.
This is the thing about that clip. You don't have to understand economics. That has nothing to do with economics. It's a very visual scene. Anyways, so check that out over on our Instagram page, over on Instagram stories. In the meantime, you have the EU here saying that not only are they going to put these counter tariffs that they announced yesterday, but they're going to add about 20 billion more in products, including American home appliances, beef, poultry. Now, notably, we mentioned bourbon and Harley Davidsons. One thing that both the EU and Canada have in common is they're targeting products made in red states, red areas of the country, hoping that that will then lead to pain for Trump voters, and those voters will then subsequently pressure Trump to drop the tariffs on the EU and Canada. So they're trying to be strategic here in where and what they're announcing counter tariffs in. Again, I mentioned that cool down with Mexico, but nonetheless, we got multiple trade wars happening now with multiple countries. As far as steel and aluminum are concerned, the administration believes that's a national security tariff, that ultimately you need to support the steel and aluminum industry here in the U.S. because of how key steel is for infrastructure, for the military. And the Trump administration does not want us to be dependent on foreign steel. So you'll often see tariffs related to aluminum and steel. We certainly saw it during the first Trump administration. And that's the thing about tariffs. In sort of at their core, they're meant to protect, they're protectionist, certain industry in your country that you see as important to your country or you want to protect. The across-the-board tariffs, that's the new iteration here that we're getting from Trump, where he just says, I'm doing a tariff on everything in your country. And by the way, it's not about protecting mine as a priority, but it's about fentanyl or it's about border security. And so that's where the expansive definition of tariffs has been a bit different here. The big question, as I mentioned, is the White House right now and the officials around it are saying, like, listen, there's going to be some pain here. There's going to be what they're calling a period of transition. How painful will that transition be? Will it include a recession? How bad will the recession be? That's what they're trying to say is like, this is the medicine we have to take because those years of high government spending and giving the market all the chocolate that it wants in terms of government spending, in terms of letting folks buy the cheapest possible goods all over the world. Well, we have certain priorities here that are not in line with that. We will be better for it in the end, but we got to go through a period of pain. But the question is, will this strategy work? How much pain will there be? How long will it be? And will the pain lead to enough pushback where they're going to have to basically relent at the White House with some of these strategies?
From Politico, Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. urging top execs from big food companies this week to remove artificial dyes before the end of his term. The FDA oversees regulation for about 80% of the nation's food supply. They're planning to work with the industry to create a federal framework on food dyes. This meeting was with leaders of PepsiCo, General Mills, Tyson Foods, Smucker's, Kraft Heinz, and Kellogg's, among others. They use dyes to make their products more attractive to consumers. However, critics say they make unhealthy food appear more appealing, and it may have negative health effects when consumed in large quantities.
Remember, this has been an issue for Kennedy for a very long time. He has argued that increased consumption of chemical-intensive processed foods is the primary culprit behind the chronic diseases that affect 6 out of 10 Americans on the campaign trail. And since then, Trump has said, I want Kennedy to go wild when it comes to his public health agenda. So this is part of what he's called the Make America Healthy Again initiative. It has put him at odds with what they're calling big food, these big companies that you just laid out there. But there is a bipartisan group of lawmakers, Democrats and Republicans, that are willing to support this aspect of the Kennedy agenda. Under the Biden administration, the FDA banned red dye number 3. That'll take several years to go into effect here. Red dye number 3 has been linked to cancer in animals and in certain quantities has had an impact on humans in various studies. At the state level, some states have targeted titanium dioxide. That's a compound used to make food appear shinier. Texas and West Virginia have moved to strip certain colorants from school lunches. So this right here, this is part of the reason Kennedy was put in there and why he was particularly popular. And so we'll see what actual impact he's going to be able to have here.
All right, now to an election we don't often track, but 2025 is different. From CNN, we have the latest from voting in Greenland. Greenland's pro-business opposition party won the Arctic Island's closely watched parliamentary election on Tuesday. This race was dominated both by President Trump's annexation threat and growing calls from residents for independence from Denmark. The center-right Demokratiet Party, which advocates for a slower approach to independence, is currently leading with just about 30% of the vote, overtaking the ruling left-wing party. A close second, the Nalarak Party, which is U.S.-friendly and wants immediate independence for the island. This year, Trump's idea to annex the territory has thrown an international spotlight on the election. It's also raised questions about the island's future security, as the United States, Russia, and China are all vying for influence in the Arctic. The incumbent ruling party and its left-wing coalition partner saw a huge drop from the previous election. They had previously won a combined 2/3 of the electorate. Greenland is a Danish autonomous territory. It's been part of Denmark for several hundred years. It is rich in oil and gas. All of the major parties agree on the desire for independence from Denmark. In almost every election in recent years, Greenland's politicians have promised to take steps to achieve autonomy, but none of them have offered a concrete timeline.
That's what's been so interesting about the impact of Trump's remarks, Trump's push to buy Greenland, to annex Greenland, however he wants to get Greenland. He said in the State of the Union last week that he's going to get it one way or another, I think was the quote. But it has really supercharged the debate in Greenland. The independence debate was always sort of there, but now it's like super top of mind. Now, what all these parties agree on, none of them want to be part of the U.S. But now increasingly independence feels like the right move. And those top two finishers right there might put them on a short road towards independence there. And then, of course, Greenland as an independent country can decide how it wants to have relations, what its relationship will be with the U.S. And so we'll see what happens there. Greenland, a reminder, super important to Trump due to all the various minerals that they have, as well as their location. You look on a map, it's closer to us, North America, than it is to Europe. So as far as Trump is concerned, why is it not a part of the U.S.? And as the Arctic melts and those shipping lanes become key and the Chinese and Russians have their eyes set on Greenland, he wants to get it first. And this is something he talked about during his first term as well, but it's really taken on a seriousness we haven't seen before in this second term. Remember, Don Trump Jr. visited there recently. And so we will see what the ramifications are of these parliamentary elections, but nonetheless, while that top party, the top finisher, isn't necessarily keen on Trump, the second place finishers, they like him and they want a close relationship with him. And in order for that first place party to actually rule, they're going to need a coalition, and it might be with that secondary party. So we'll keep checking in on Greenland as news develops.
Another sign of the times from NBC News, Chuck E. Cheese has recently overhauled its brand, bringing major changes to its nearly 500 locations that longtime visitors might be surprised to see. The biggest, the removal of its iconic animatronic band as the family-friendly entertainment and restaurant chain, which was founded in 1977, looks to welcome the next generation of kids. It has modernized and chosen to leave Mr. Munch and the members of Munch's make-believe band behind.
Oh, is that what he was called, Mr. Munch?
I guess so. I hadn't really heard that name before, but I guess it makes sense.
Listen, I never knew their names. I just figured Chuck was one of them in the band. But nonetheless, the company's CEO says after 47 years, it's time to move on. Apparently 47 years ago, that was quite an innovation when that came out there in the late 70s, early 80s. But we've, of course, moved on. Technology has moved on. And so they're going to look to digitize Chuck E. Cheese moving forward for Alpha Gen and Beta Gen, or whatever we're going to call them. And so ultimately, the mascots, say goodbye to them, Jill, next time you're at Chuck E. Cheese.
Which is more often than you might think, actually.
Now, if they could only make the pizza better there.
I like the pizza. I don't mind the pizza. It's like Ilios. I feel like all pizza's good.
First of all, that is something we're not going to agree on. I don't think all pizza is good. We gotta have standards here on the podcast, Joe.
I think some pizza is better than others, and I think some pizza is exceptional.
You haven't had bad pizza.
But I like pretty much all pizza. I mean, it's dough, cheese, and tomato sauce.
Correct. All right, we will continue the piece of discussion another day because we're going to get to On This Day in History on this March 13th. And Jill, that's when we celebrate a birthday for a certain planet that comes up annually here on the podcast. Happy 244th birthday to Uranus. Now, obviously, the planet's like 1 billion plus years old, but we've only known about it and had a name for it for 244 years.
I really learned Uranus. That is actually the pronunciation that I learned in
Jill,
school.
this is a family-friendly podcast. We really gotta tone it down. On this day in 1781, English astronomer William Herschel observed the seventh planet from the sun. It was named after the father of the god Saturn. Saturn, of course, is the sixth planet from the sun. It was long mistaken, Uranus, as a star because of how dim it was and how slow its orbit is. And anyway, that's the deal with Uranus. But thank you for many years of middle school level jokes. All right, a couple pop culture mentions before we go here. On this day, 33 years ago, My Cousin Vinny premiered in theaters.
Should I do it? My biological clock is ticking like this.
It's a movie that's given us many great quotes, and people still quoting it there more than 3 decades later.
The youths.
The three youths. 36 years ago today, Do You Believe in Life After Love? Cher reaches number 1 on the Billboard charts, one of the many times she has, but this one for Believe on this day in 1999. And 49 years ago tonight, Oh What a Night. On this day in history, the Four Seasons reached number 1 with their hit, Oh What a Night, December 1963, notably released on March 13th, 1976. So what's interesting is it's a song from 1976, written about 1963, and the lyrics were actually originally set in 1933. The original title was December 5th, 1933, to celebrate the repeal of Prohibition. But Frankie Valli was like, listen, we're going to make this song about one of our bandmates and the first time he was with a girl. And so they changed it from a celebration of Prohibition to a celebration of Oh What a Night.
I feel like that was probably a better move commercially.
Don't make it about booze, make it about a girl.
I think so. Although it has a catchy tune, I think it would have been successful probably either way.
As we've discussed on this podcast, sometimes it's about the tune and the lyrics don't matter as much. But anyway, a little background for you on Oh What a Night.
Okay, from Uranus to Oh What a Night.
Don't forget, we had Greenland in the mix too. We talk about the range of this podcast, but this one in particular.
All right, guys. Thank you for listening to this very diverse Mo News podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this with your friends. It helps us grow. Follow us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us in the App Store.
All right, everybody. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
Thanks for listening to the Mo News podcast. Have a fantastic day. I hope you enjoyed.